Hello and good morning, good evening, and good afternoon, wherever you are. My name is Andreas Bummel, and I'm the Executive Director of Democracy Without Borders. I am also coordinator of the campaign for a UN Parliamentary Assembly. I would like to welcome you all at this event that will discuss the proposed United Nations Parliamentary Assembly. My part today is to provide an introduction to the topic and to moderate. This session is part of the virtual UN 75 Global Governance Forum that was held in the previous 2 days. Many thanks to the Stimson Center and the other organizers of the forum for hosting this community-driven session. In particular, thanks to Richard Pancio and Christina Pechu. Richard, are you there? Would you like to say a few words at the beginning?
Happy to, wasn't expecting, but thank you very much. No, we're delighted to have you all, to thank everybody who's been participating in all of our sessions. I would be remiss if I didn't say we have another round, 5 more sessions to go immediately after. Stay here for the entire session. It's going to be fantastic, one of our favorites. And then join us for the last 90 minutes. All of these sessions will be archived and we'll be including details in the recap. So please promote it in your networks, because as you're going to see, this is going to be one of the best sessions of the forum.
Fantastic. Thank you, Richard, for these kind words. We are also looking forward to this discussion. And obviously, the Stimson Program on Global Security, Justice and Governance is supporting a UN parliamentary network as a step towards the UNPA. And it was great to see that this network and the UNPA actually came up several times during the forum. And now is our opportunity to discuss this more. Primarily, we are here because we want to hear today from our distinguished panelists who are joining us from 3 world regions and who will share their views with us. And I would like to introduce them right away in alphabetical order, and later they will intervene and make their views heard. First, that's Darren Beckmann. Welcome. He's a member of the South African National Assembly. He's been an MP since 2014, and he is the Shadow Minister of International Relations and Cooperation of the Democratic Alliance in South Africa. Further, I would like to welcome Dominic de Veza. He is a member of the European Parliament since the last year. He's coming from Spain, and in the European Parliament, he's serving on the Committee on Constitutional Affairs, and he is a longtime collaborator and a well-known European and world federalist. Further, I welcome Nomsa Tarabella Mashezi, who's also from the South African National Assembly. She's a member of the Assembly for the 2nd term. She's in charge of the education portfolio at the Democratic Alliance, and previously she held a position in the portfolio of women in the presidency. Welcome to Alhagi Mbo, also from the Gambia, a member of the National Assembly for the National Reconciliation Party. And he has also been a member of the Pan-African Parliament since 2017. He is an IT engineer and spent over 20 years in the private sector before going into the parliament. Finally, in alphabetical order, let me welcome Lilia Puig, who is a member of the Mercosur Parliament, Parlasur, from Argentina. Since 2015, she previously also was a member of the National Parliament in Argentina, and she's with the Union Cívica Radical. Again, a cordial welcome and many thanks that you are available today to share your views. So the proceedings of this event will be as follows. All in all, we have 80 minutes available. Then next sessions of the forum will start, so we need to be punctual. In the next 5 minutes, I will provide a general introduction to the theme of the UNPA. And then we will have a first round with interventions from our distinguished guests. Each of these interventions should not be longer than roughly like 5 minutes. I hope and anticipate that we will have an interactive discussion with short interventions and thoughts from all who wish to express such. And after that, we will have an open discussion between the panelists as well. and some follow-up questions for me, perhaps. The last 25 minutes, we will open the floor and pick up questions from the audience. And perhaps if there's an opportunity, we might pick up the one other question even before. So the idea of a global parliament is more than 100 years old, and the specific proposal of the UNPA goes back to 1949. This session is now the first discussion that we organize after the official publication of Democracy Without Borders new study 3 days ago on the occasion of the UN 75th anniversary. This study is the most comprehensive one that exists so far and reflects current thinking on the proposal that has evolved in the past decades, and especially in the past 10 or 20 years since the campaign for UN Parliamentary Assembly exists. I would like to post the link to that study into the chat box. Let me see whether I can manage to do that quickly. Here we go. So you can look at that once you have an opportunity, but don't read it while we have this session. We need your attention. So I would summarize, if I had to summarize it in one sentence, actually, I would say the best way probably to understand the UNPA proposal is to look at it not as a static model, a static proposal, but as an institutionalized process that we would like to set into motion. We envision UNPA to function as a catalyst for UN reform and for strengthening democracy and global governance over time. In the beginning, the UNPA would start in modest ways, for instance, as a largely consultative subsidiary body established by the UN General Assembly with representatives coming from national parliaments, or perhaps regional parliaments too, like the EP, the European Parliament, or the Pan-African Parliament. And our study recommends that the powers and functions of that assembly would be expanded over time gradually, with the long-term objective that it would develop into an actual world parliament whose members are directly elected by the global population. Initially, we suggest representatives should be selected by political groups in existing parliaments, whereby the opposition is to be represented. It is recommended that the assembly is open to universal participation. That's a point that is often discussed, and that the allocation of seats per country should initially follow the principle of digressive proportionality. The work is to be based on transnational political groups formed by individual representatives. So it would not be country groups or geopolitical groups, but groups established according to political views that the representatives in the assembly share across national borders. Well, I mean, I will just now finish this introduction. The possible design of a UNPA is very complex, and we can today only scratch the surface. Who would like to dig deeper into it should download and then read the study. Now, for our panelists, I have several food for thoughts that they could pick up, because for somebody who is not familiar with how the UN and foreign affairs function, it may not be immediately obvious what's so special about this proposed new assembly, in particular at the early stages, and how this assembly actually represents a revolutionary step in global affairs. So maybe our panelists all can elaborate a bit on why they think a UNPA is important and what impact this assembly may have. Maybe you can share some reflections on why it is relevant, starting from your own personal experience as an elected representative. And maybe if you have thoughts, it would be interesting to learn what you think are the main obstacles and what is needed for implementation. Now let's start our discussion, perhaps on the theme of democracy, as democracy is under pressure worldwide at this stage. We don't need to dig into that deeper. We want to specialize really on the UNPA proposal. But one of the principles of the UNPA is to make sure that the opposition is represented. So I would like to start off the discussion perhaps with Nomsa from South Africa with the Democratic Alliance, and pose the question, do you think that giving a voice to opposition members of parliament in the UNPA may help strengthen democracy at the national level as well?
Thank you, Andreas, and good afternoon to everyone. First of all, I just want to go through my belief and why I think UNPA is important. I believe that there is no time that is better than now for us to be able to speed up and establish the UNPA. I say this because of what you have seen with the worldwide COVID-19 crisis, which has basically exposed how flawed the current global cooperation system is. And that emerging from the lack of transparency, and which we actually, unfortunately, have been accustomed to, and actually setting us up to a very chaotic response to the crisis. And leading to this regression on progress, we've seen a number of sustainable development goals, which have basically been put aside and will have to play catch up as countries on this. When you talk about the sustainable development goals like economic growth, education, poverty, gender inequality, and eradication of hunger, and even gender-based violence, which has unfortunately surged dramatically globally during lockdown and caused primarily by what women have been saying, that they don't have economic autonomy for themselves to be able to look after themselves. So to go back to what you have posed as a question, to say, do I think that it's important for our democracy to have a what do you call it, a opposition within the UNPA? There won't be any democracy. Our democracy depends on, for it to be able to function, it depends primarily on basically having political parties and also those who are in opposition to be able to hold the executive to account. So basically the agency of doing this is very important. And also, what I've seen personally in my own political party, how we are able to hold the executive to account. And if you look at the UNPA, I believe that it has to be a mirror image of our parliaments, the way that they are at the moment. I understand the logistical and also it could be financial hurdles that could come up with that, but it is important that you have that, because currently the system that we have is not able to serve the population entirely as we would expect it to be. I'll make an example with what we've seen with WHO at the moment, how it handled the crisis. It was very much myopic in terms of just looking at the health response, and therefore leaving these kind of issues that I've mentioned, like our pertinent issues that affect our day-to-day lives, that affect our citizens, our global citizens on day-to-day basis. So to say that we need to move into a direction whereby we have a more consolidated and more progressive kind of parliament that will include not only the politicians, but at some stage to also make sure that there are people from the society that become part of this body. Because accountability is very important, and also implementation. And one has to also remember that when you have a situation whereby you have members of the society being the one that represent the needs or even the issues that impact them in their own countries, then they don't have any kind of obligation as such to say that they have to be partisan, which is something that I would like to also highlight, which is basically how I believe if you have political parties being responsible for the UNPA, then there could be some kind of posturing that you see sometimes with political parties, whereby that you are unable to reach or even to be able to have any concession on different issues. So first of all, for now, I totally agree with NPA and what you guys are driving to say, let's have political parties for now, and then, but at later stage, let the people from the ground be the ones that decide who should be, because we need to have more binding commitments in the United Nations. We need to see more oversight. We need to see more accountability, and we also need to see implementation. And as much as we might have competing issues from different countries, I think if you have a more focused kind of parliament on issues that affect different regions. In South Africa, for instance, we have gender-based violence. I think for us, it's one of the biggest pandemic, even competing just as much with the coronavirus. So by basically putting that issue on the side and focusing on coronavirus crisis, it has basically set us back as a country. So those things needs to be looked at, and also for us to be able to say, how do you move forward and what is it that we need, that needs to be done? And I believe that UNPA is going to a critical and a vital role to play in ensuring that we exercise our democracy and basically have everyone's voice to be heard and their rights to also be exercised. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just a very quick follow-up sentence, follow-up question that you might say just a few sentences about. You mentioned that perhaps political parties should not play the key role at a later stage. Do you mean by that that you think direct elections should take place, or can you elaborate more on that? Because even direct elections would probably work through party lists, right?
Yes.
Maybe you can clarify that just very quickly.
Okay. So basically, like what I think is like, when you talk about, if you have political parties that are the ones that are responsible for the day-to-day of the UNPA, you might have a situation that we are seeing now in the UN, whereby, those countries with financial clout, the plutocrats being the ones that basically dictate on the direction and the issues that are being decided and driven within the UNPA. But then on the other hand, I still believe that if you have people that are not a non-partisan, could actually, be more effective going forward in terms of ensuring that we do have, they basically hold the executive to account in the United Nations.
Thank you very much. I have the feeling we might come back to that topic later. And yeah, it's very interesting. Speaking of direct elections and accountability, one of the principles also inbuilt in the concept of the UNPA is actually to draw on existing examples. And we are fortunate to have a couple of panelists here who have been part of international parliamentary institutions. Many of such exist. And I would like to bring in Lilita Puig into this discussion, who is a member of the Mercosur Parliament. And perhaps, Lilita, can you explain whether you think that there are important lessons perhaps from Parlasur for UNPA? And speaking of elections, I mean, perhaps you can say a few words also on the state of affairs. I understand there should be direct elections in all Mercosur countries for the Parlasur, but this has not yet worked out. And can you imagine global direct elections for UNPA in the foreseeable future? At least in some countries, we would be extremely interested to hear from you on that.
Well, thank you very much, and good morning, good afternoon for everybody. Well, first of all, I would like to say that I think that this moment when democracy has been is going through a process in the last decades, that we have been the decrease of democracy, and that because of the pandemic, we are seeing democratic governments that are going back in recognition of human rights. In Latin America, in Argentina also, we are going through a moment where the executive is taking emergency decisions, and the parliament is working in a very small way and with a very short agenda. And we have problems in our states, our provinces. We have a federal government. In most of our provinces, justice is not working. And we have some very strong problems with people going from one province to another because it is impossible to cross the borders. So we can see that the coronavirus pandemic have left behind the parliamentary participations. So in this moment, I think that the pandemic is showing the main problem, that is the enough trust for institutional form of democracy. So for this reason, I think that in this moment is much more necessary to try to understand the importance of the democratization of the United Nations. Besides, I have a problem with the language. A lot of time that I don't speak in English. I think democracy is also suffering because the states and the international order have not been successful to prevent the pandemic and its effects on people's health, women and children abuse, economical crisis, and other problems. So I think that both have failed. They were not prepared to attend this global public problem. And I think that, as you say in the book, I read the book, and I think really that this is a special moment. That is because have appeared again values that are against democracy, returning to the situation we were in the world before the Second World War. So I think it is necessary for us to conquer people, to demand democracy in the international relations and the citizen representation. I agree with your proposition about party representation in the organization, but I want to mix both things, no? Things that you say in the book and my own experience in Parliament. I think that it's crucial that the UNPA has a clear jurisdiction and a proper agenda, its own competition on some kind of global issues that have to be attended. Nevertheless, the states, because they are affecting humans. So I want to point out this because in my experience, one of the problems of legitimacy the Parliament of Mercosur has actually is to have a proper jurisdiction, because when the other members of the parliament, of the national parliaments, think that this regional parliament, in this case a world parliament, is interfering in its own jurisdiction, what began is a process to dislegitimate the regional parliament, or in this case, the world parliament. Nobody wants, representatives don't want to have to, their duties be in discussion. Its representations in discussion. This has been, is a very big problem in the Parliament of Mercosur, because the absence of a non-jurisdictions leads the production of distrust from the members of national parliaments. And this has produced a delay in direct elections. We have, the parliament is actually mixed Argentina and Paraguay, we are the only countries with direct elections. Now Paraguay has returned to indirect election, but this is not definitely because all the countries have to accept this change in the rules. But nevertheless, this point, the issue is that the Congress in Paraguay has returned to indirect representation. Saying what? Saying about the budget, that it's expensive. When you look, the budget is not that expensive. I think the problem is other, and the problem is the lack of a proper problems. And so I think we have big global problems that not only climate problems, but I want to refer just to limit my voice.
Yes.
To immigration. We have seen in this Latin America how has been the immigration from Venezuela in the last 5 years. 4 million people has gone out of that country and are everywhere in Latin America. And the United States have done anything. So I think that there are new global problems that only can be accomplished by be attended by representatives of citizens. Of course, I believe, as the preceding speaker says, that is necessary a relationship not only with other parliaments, but also with citizens' organizations, and provide the institutions for their participation, because this time is a time where political representation is under question also. So we have to think in new institutions. Well, this is my first interview. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent. That's a lot of food for thought. I would like to just, again, very quick, just for a few sentences, perhaps as a response, address one question you touched on, and that's because usually it is assumed that national governments are those that are the biggest obstacle for UN reform generally and for the Parliamentary Assembly in particular. But from what you said, there is some indication that national parliaments themselves also might not be enthusiastic about this for several reasons. That seems to be the case, at least in Mercosur. Is that right?
Yes, in the case of Brazil, this is the point. The parliaments don't want to go through direct elections because they have a very difficult problems of they have problems of representation. Brazil is a federal country, and the way they organize their elections, trying to fulfill the necessities of the different levels of the government in the representation, make them real problems. So I think that we have to deal also with this other question, no? That we have federal countries and we have unitary countries. And this is something to be considered, because the balance of the territories and the populations is sometimes difficult. Depends on the country, no?
Yes.
But I think that indirect elections has to be first, and then study and prepare the way direct elections could be.
Right, very good. That's a takeaway that we can note down for the moment. And that's also the process that is generally suggested, starting with indirect elections and then moving forward to direct elections in a hybrid way even. I would also like to note the Mercosur Parliament actually in 2011 adopted a resolution in favor of a UN Parliamentary Assembly. And it's interesting because if you look at existing political support, it comes often from regional parliamentary bodies, not necessarily the national parliaments. So that seems to confirm what has been said about the obstacles. Now let's look a little bit perhaps at the example of the Pan-African Parliament. we have a member of the Pan-African Parliament here, Ali Bo from the Gambia. The Pan-African Parliament has supported the UNPA through resolutions in 2007 and in 2016. And I think it would be interesting not only to learn in how far is the Pan-African Parliament perhaps an institutional example, but also what do you think, Alagi, in terms of whether the Pan-African Parliament could be an example and an engine for UNPA? And maybe in brackets, as a footnote, another question, we don't have much time, but is it the case from your perspective, do the African Union governments actually still support the PAP, the Pan-African Parliament? Do they have second thoughts about it? And what is the situation? We are extremely interested in hearing that.
I would just like, just to make it short, since we are out of time, just to state categorically clear that I think the Pan-African Parliament could be an example. Now, the Pan-African Parliament really is a platform where people from all African states are involved in discussions and decision-making on problems and challenges facing the continent. Now, the membership, which means the parliamentarians are actually elected from their own parliaments. So, which means there is no direct election into the Pan-African Parliament. Each country actually has to send 5 representations. And those 5 must include an opposition member, and it must also include a woman or 2. So effectively, really, we are trying to have a well-balanced group from each country, making it 5. So which means if you are part of the African Union and you are sending your membership to the Pan-African Parliament, you send in 5, but those 5 must include a woman and also must include a member of the opposition party. And that's exactly how it is. So directly we are not elected, but indirectly it comes from our own parliament. And I think the UN PA could start from that with respect to that strategy that the Pan-African Parliament is actually using. And gradually they can go into direct elections if there is a need to be. Because the way it's done by the Pan-African Parliament, really, it makes it very easy. After the elections of a country, the speaker or the clerk of the particular assembly is going to submit 5 names to the Pan-African Parliament. And those 5 names are being vetted by the members of the parliament themselves. They choose them and they confirm them, and they are sent to represent that particular country. So, and I think the UNPA could actually learn from that perspective. Now, on the other side, you're going to see that the Pan-African Parliament really, we are not yet a legislative body. What we are doing right now at the moment is really to facilitate and oversee implementation of AU policies and objectives and programs. Because countries, about 29 member countries, are supposed to sign and ratify the convention that would give us the legislative power to be able to make laws, or particular laws, if I may say, not general laws, but particular laws that will be applied across the continent. But at this stage, I think we still have, we don't still have the numbers. My country, the Gambia, was among the first that actually signed and ratified and deposited the legal instrument at the AU, as well as our neighbors Senegal and Mali. But we are still behind. I think we need an additional 14. The last time I checked, we need about another 14 members states that would sign, ratify, and deposit the legal instruments at the AU. So to say that some of the countries are dragging their feet, I would say yes. And why? Perhaps it's going to be it's a political thing, to be honest with you. But I don't see any reason why any member country of the AU, being a member, why you should drag your feet on giving the legislative powers to the Pan-African Parliament. Now, the fear perhaps could be, there are a lot of fears actually, because again, at the level of the AU, once decisions are made, it actually cuts across all the countries that are part of the African Union. So if we have the legislative body, that means any legislative that we have done at the level of the African Parliament, then it also cuts across. Again, you know, you see that some of these countries in Africa, their democracy really is really far-fetched from what really the rest of the world needs. For example, term limits, that is not being exercised in many countries, for example. Then the way presidents are elected into office, and the way the legislature actually are elected in office, there are really different ways of countries are doing it. Even the term itself, we have some countries that are 4 years term, like Ghana. You have countries like the Gambia that have 5-year terms, and you have countries like Senegal that have 7-year terms. It's really very different. Now, I think, again, to an extent, I think some of the heads of states or some of the countries really, the fear is if they signed and ratified this legal instrument, that would actually bind us as a continent to have legislative powers. I think their fear is like some of these laws will be changed at their own detriment. But again, in a global democracy, I don't see any reason why somebody would like to stay in office for the rest of their lives, or somebody would like to just not to be very objective in the way they handle the manners or they handle the affairs of a particular country. So I think I will agree that some countries are dragging their feet because of fear that once we have that legislative power, then perhaps some of the things they would like to do in their countries, they may not be able to do anymore. And I think that fear is still there. And but we are lobbying still across the continent. From the president of the Pan-African Parliament, we call him the speaker. We are lobbying. Some of the members of parliament are also lobbying just to ensure that we have the 29 that are actually required. Now we've been talking, among ourselves, not like we're going to have one constitution that would define how Africa is actually governed, but there are certain key elements of a constitution of governance that we can actually agree to in terms of term limits, etc.
Thank you. Very good. So is it the case, if I may have a very quick follow-up question, if you allow that, is it the case that the African Union protocol on the Pan-African Parliament originally envisaged direct elections much earlier? I remember that, and it seems like on that point, they did have second thoughts. I mean, the governments, is that right?
Yeah, yes, they did. And that's the reason why they shifted that thought and then just use the indirect elections, where it makes it very easy. Every country you are responsible. In fact, they push it back to the parliaments. Their parliament themselves would elect 5 members to represent them, but with various diversity in terms of inclusion of women and the inclusion of the opposition party to make it more diverse. And now they shifted that to the parliaments themselves to do those elections.
Very good. Maybe we can come back to that point of direct elections also later.
Sure.
I don't know, not enough time. And
thank you.
I would like to ask Darren Beckmann from South Africa whether he thinks, what would be needed for the government of South Africa or other governments to support a UN Parliamentary Assembly. We need to keep in mind that South Africa took a very strong lead in the creation of the Pan-African Parliament at the time. And in fact, the Pan-African Parliament seat is in Midrand between Johannesburg and Pretoria. So might it not be in the realms of possibility, since South Africa pioneered that regional assembly, that it would also take up the idea of a parliamentary assembly globally? What do you think?
I think South Africa is in a great position at the moment in the sense that it chairs the African Union. It sits on the Security Council at this stage, and it was a South African that actually started the UN League of Nations at the time. So it's an opportune time for South Africa to do something drastic and bold. Quite weirdly, the history to this is that I've been proposing on the different caps that I wear, both in Liberal International, in SADC, in parliaments. I've always believed that the UN has to reform. That it can't be business as usual within the UN, and I think COVID has provided that push, where I think we've seen the most of bad progress under COVID-19 in terms of countries with nefarious intent try to push agendas, and I think we've seen that in Zimbabwe to a certain extent. We've maybe seen that with certain other countries where people are crying foul. I think it's time where the UN could maybe push for the good, and I think that something like proposing the UNPA is the right opportune time to make a bold call for this. And since reading your proposal, what I've done is I've presented it to the Normandy Peace Forum, and they've been excited about it. I've presented it to Liberal International, to our Human Rights Committee, and they've been excited about it. So everyone you speak to in silos gets excited about it. So in all the different small forums, everyone's excited about it, but then of course they're all in silos. So how do you eat an elephant? You start with small bites. And when it comes to lobbying governments, I suppose you have to start little government by little government. But South Africa has always been one that's been trying to change the UN in the sense that they've been fighting for Africa to have a more permanent seat at the Security Council. Now, for me, you know, when I speak about the UN, and please understand that when I talk about the UN, you might hear a negative connotation the whole time. I'm focusing on the negative. I believe the UN does a lot of good, but I focus on the negative because I'm highlighting what is wrong with the UN. I'm actually very optimistic about the UN, but I have to highlight what is actually wrong with the UN. And, you know, at this stage, I think there's almost a political capture of the UN. So when we talk about reporting, there's almost a biased reporting that comes out. And I think the UNPA can be an oversight committee to what is coming out of the UN. People think they don't understand the UN very well. They believe that the UN Human Rights Council and the UN Security Council are the same thing. And if the UN Human Rights Council says the country must jump, that the country jumps. You know, that they don't understand the difference in international law. So I think the UN Parliament Assembly would have an oversight role to play. I think exactly as my colleague from Pan-African Parliament said, we've got the formula. You don't have to have expensive elections. You can leave it up to the countries to send their own representation and how they want to choose their representation. You can ask that they just do it with that they do send opposition, you know, and in countries where there's not usually an opposition that's readily available, you make it, you know, you pierce that country veil where there has to be an opposition that's available. But there has to be a monitoring of the reports that come out. So let's say there's conflict between country A and country B. There's a checklist that the UNPA puts out and says, did we consult country A and did we consult country B? Did we speak to both the party in power and the parties in opposition, both in country A and in country B? Yes. Did we speak to businesses? Did we speak to the people on the ground? And basically build a file that people can access anywhere from any station. They don't have to get it from the media. You know, they don't have to get it from what is the speeches that are made in the UN. They can actually build their own opinion based on what is fact. And I think when the UN start playing at a more even field, check, I think that's where we're going to find a more peaceful approach to problems, where I think we might find that the UNPA plays a more substantial role. There was a question where someone said, or there was a comment on the side I was monitoring, where someone said the last thing we need is global politicians, local politicians playing global warrior, which is correct. You know, I don't think national parliamentarians qualify as global politicians just because they're parliamentarians. Yeah. I think what you need are global people with worldly aspirations, or people with general knowledge of the world that come out and are willing to speak out and are willing to be global players that take up those seats in the UN and then speak out. And I think the UNPA is that vehicle. You know, if we can find the right vehicle, we need to go out and sell it. And I think you really are. You're at the right time, at the right place, with the right proposal.
Very good, thank you. And I took note that you've been raising it at the Liberal International and other fora. So perhaps we can, in fact, follow up on this. The Liberal International, I don't know whether the current leadership that knows that, but the Liberal International in 2005 adopted a resolution, in fact, supporting a UNPA. And I remember there was a report on UN reform even earlier in the 1990s, when the LI said they actually support a directly elected world parliament. So this is really interesting, and I will get back to that. Now, if we look at international parliamentary institutions, of course, the European Parliament is the one that at this time is most developed. It's an actual legislative body of the European Union. And that's why I'm very happy that Dominic is with us. Dominic is not only a member of the European Parliament, but also, as I said at the very beginning, when you haven't had yet the opportunity to be with us, but he's also a long-standing supporter of the UNPA and a world and European federalist, who is a member of the Constitutional Committee. And the European Parliament since 1994 has actually adopted many resolutions in favor of the UN Parliamentary Assembly. So my question, Dominic, for the pleasure of the audience, or for the audience, do you think that the European Parliament could be an example and an engine for UNPA? As a step-by-step process, the European Parliament developed over time, over decades actually. And if we look at it from that perspective, do we have so much time to develop a global parliament? Do we have 60 years still to do that, like it happened with the European Parliament? Dominic, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andreas, very much. Thank you very much, Andreas, for the invitation and for your hard work with the UNPA campaign and Democracy Without Borders. I'm fully supportive of all the initiatives that you and other companions undertake regarding global democracy. Just a short disclaimer. My 4.5-year-old son is at home playing with the ball. He's far away, but at some point he may come closer. So if you hear like a ball, moving, don't be afraid and excuse me for that. Now, on your question, well, it is true that of course the European Parliament started being just a parliamentary assembly in the 1950s. It did not have the name European Parliament, of course. This is a name that the assembly gave it to herself or to itself many years before the actual treaties formalize the parliament name for the institution. For many decades, it was not directly elected, not until 1979. It always had from the beginning the budgetary power for the union budget. So even if it was not a legislative, it did not have the power to approve laws, but it did have the power from the beginning on the budget, alongside, with the Council of Ministers representing the governments. And it's actually with the Treaty of Maastricht in 1992 that it started to have the legislative power in a number of fields, not in all policy fields. And since 2009, with the Lisbon Treaty, we have co-decision power with the Council on most policy fields, with some exceptions, notably taxation, foreign policy, security, and so on. So yes, there has been a big progress. As you said, Andreas is the most developed, probably supranational parliament. But it took many years, as you said, and certainly we don't want to wait 60 years for UNPA, that's for sure, at least not me. But also we have to bear in mind that the reason why the European Parliament became what it is today, it is not just because the institution itself, fought very effectively for gaining power and importance, but also there was a bit of a deterministic path, because the European Union is a supranational project from the start. But unfortunately, this philosophy is not in the UN Charter. Or if it is, it's not, it is not, I don't think it is not understood by the member states of the UN that they belong to an organization that has a potential that goes beyond an intergovernmental organization. But the EU, from the beginning, had these supranational federalistic elements, no, that helped developing the European Parliament in the direction that you mentioned. So this is, I guess, one difficulty that we have in the UN context. You want to say something?
Yes, well, no, go on. I have just, it came to my mind some follow-up question, namely, can you hear me? Namely,
Yes.
Whether, I mean, you know, the European Parliament is now playing a role, I mean, it has done so before, but now at this point, playing a role in pushing forward the Conference on the Future of Europe. That's a project you are involved in a lot. So speaking of supranational integration, can you imagine a UNPA sometime in the future driving forward a global constitutional process, which is what we think about, you know, that this Parliamentary Assembly would push forward the transformation of the UN. But then again, of course, the problem comes in that you just described, that the governments did not subscribe to the UN as a supranational project, but perhaps the UNPA could move them into that direction. What do you think?
Yes, yes, for sure. The moment we establish the UNPA, it will, I'm sure, develop a dynamic on its own. And it can push for a project like the one you mentioned. I'm sure. I mean, the parliamentary institutions always, I think, by and large. I mean, I'm not an expert, for example, on how the Mercosur Parliament works, but once you have a parliamentary body, which is the essence of democracy. Let's not forget that. There are always three powers in a democratic system, but the most important one, the one that is most, legitimized popularly, is the parliament. And we have seen it with the pandemic, how authoritarian governments have taken the chance, to undermine democracy because parliaments could not operate as effectively as before the pandemic. So this is a clear example. And of course, the European Parliament has showed many times that plans that were developed by governments or by the Commission then fell in the European Parliament because it did not have enough support. Think also, for example, is a very specific example, very curious, which is the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. I don't know if you're familiar with this. This is a very curious object that we may want to study further also for UNPA because it is not really part of the NATO treaty. It was somehow established because all the governments, belonging to NATO agreed to do it. And now everyone calls it the NATO Parliamentary Assembly and it's recognized as such, but it is not really, again, in the NATO treaty. The president of the assembly, has a very good interlocution with the Secretary General of NATO. So, they are recognized as interlocutors. It is really, I mean, a fledgling, institution with some, for me, weird features, like they don't really have political groupings. They have national groupings. They have informal political groupings, but not formal political groupings. And of course, the US senators and congressmen do not belong to anyone, which is a pity, I mean, ideologically speaking. But they have been able really to create a parliamentary institution in a way out of thin air that is recognized as such by NATO itself. And they pass their resolutions and they have influence, if not power, by now. So I think we have to always bet on the potential and future power of supranational parliamentary bodies and be as creative as we can. In setting them up or in promoting them. No? We know that, and you know this, Andreas, better than me, that, just a moment, that you know better than me, that in reality, that the procedure to set it up in the UN is not really that hard. No, we need a majority in the UN General Assembly. So it's not really, I mean, it's hard to convince governments that we have to do it for sure. And we really have to also try to make it part of the EU foreign policy agenda.
Yeah.
And now that I think the High Representative is going to update the the global policy agenda, because Mogherini developed a very good one in 2016. Yeah. But the world has radically changed. I mean, the Mogherini agenda is before Brexit and before the election of Trump. So just think about that. But if we get enough support, then the actual procedure is not that hard. It's simpler, for example, than changing the EU treaties. That we need, unanimity, 27 national parliamentary ratifications, and we would like to do that as a result of the Conference on the Future of Europe. So I think we could be a bit upbeat about being able to do it at the General Assembly.
Thank you very much. Also for mentioning the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, which at the time was an initiative coming from individual parliamentarians. They simply came together and they did it. And over time, the NATO recognized the assembly de facto. So
exactly.
That's an interesting process. And perhaps I would like to bring in all speakers again in another round of interventions. And you can be very brief with your responses, really. You don't need to respond on each question. Nonetheless, perhaps this topic of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly and how that came about makes it possible to raise the idea of the UN Parliamentary Network again, meaning the network would also be a body that is initially not UN recognized, but a body of parliamentarians who come together saying they want to deal with UN governance matters. So my question then to all, and please be brief in your responses because we have some other topics coming up from the audience, but the question then would be, would you support the UN Parliamentary Network as an intermediary step to a parliamentary assembly? Or would you say, no, we need to aim for the full-fledged assembly from the start? And a tricky element in this discussion is the Interparliamentary Union that was raised also from the audience, because the Interparliamentary Union represents national parliaments. And one could argue, well, isn't the IPU's UN committee already doing the business that the UN Parliamentary Assembly would deal with? So if you have any views on that, that would be highly appreciated. And so you got an option to respond either on that or on something different. I would like to then also introduce a second element, namely, we know there is resistance on the part of some governments, on the part of some parliaments, like we heard before. But do you believe it is possible to mobilize the citizens of the public, the general public, in favor of a global parliament? Is that possible? Because if there was a big public push, then I believe, at least in democracies, those obstacles would quickly disappear if it's popular to do this. So I don't know, in random order, maybe you can just raise your hand if you have, if you understand. Darren, I saw you first, so the floor is yours.
Thank you. Look, I think what the public wants an organization or a parliament with teeth, something that can, a body that can act. They're seeing the atrocities that are taking place. They're seeing that there's the right to veto makes a Mickey Mouse out of the, out of the process. And it's not an attack on any country. It's just that if you have to also look through the votes taken at the UN, and you look at the patterns, there's no logic or there's no consistency necessarily to those votes. So again, if you're an academic and you're looking at the voting patterns, you might get confused as to whether there's actually logic to those voting patterns or whether there's politics to those voting patterns. So people are looking for something that has teeth, so something that actually has power. So if there's an atrocity caused in Syria, if there's an atrocity caused in Zimbabwe, or atrocity wherever it is, that all of a sudden there's something that can happen in real time. There's a censor that could happen that would not punish the people in that country. You know, we must also understand that we must be able to censor in a way that it's the government that gets punished and not the people on the ground. So it must be an organization with teeth.
Right, very good. So this is, I would say, a plea that we should skip the parliamentary network step and aim for something strong, because that's what's going to have popular support. That's now, I'm sorry, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that's how I understood it. Namsa.
Thank you. I also have to agree. Personally, being a member of parliament, I can say that, you know, the programs that the United Nations has, I have no understanding, or even I don't get enough information of what is happening in the United Nations. And I think with a more transparent body that can be privy to the ends of United Nations. I'm just going to make an example. Like, for instance, I don't know if that is happening in other countries. Like in South Africa, we have a dedicated parliamentary TV channel. I know that is very much trivial if you think about it. But South African citizens are really very much privy and in understanding of the workings and the programs and the performance of the South African politicians on how we are, you know, you are holding the executive to account and this accountability. Yes, we have our own challenges. We have challenges of corruption and so forth, but we know at least South Africans are aware of what is happening within our parliament. So I think we need to move away from secret meetings or, you know, closed meetings whereby the citizens have no idea what is happening. And those decisions, they basically are the ones that are they're affecting them on a daily basis. So I think if we have, people from the communities, that I'm just saying from the different countries, being the ones that are part of this body, which I think for me it would be, I think, the best way to go. And I believe that we need something that can be able to be effective as soon as possible, and to be able to address all these issues that different nations are faced with. And also, because there won't be any, tithing, they're not tying them to political parties, then it should be something that we need to do. Make sure that, we get to a body that will be able to address all these issues as soon as possible. We don't have all the time that you were talking about, all these years that it has taken for this parliament to be able to function. So we need to move quickly, and I think that's the way that that's the only way that we can be able to achieve that. Thank you very much. I just heard that there was some problems with the audio, so I would like to repeat my previous question. So the question was, should we aim at a full-fledged parliamentary assembly that has real powers, that is accepted and established by the UN? Or is it possible or preferable to do a first pragmatic step based on the example of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, where individual MPs at the beginning just came together and did it? And we have now heard two interventions saying we should aim at the full-fledged assembly that has actual powers, because that's what the people want. They want an institution with teeth. And I would like to perhaps introduce another question following up on that, because isn't it the case that if we are aiming for a body that has power, we still need to talk about what power that is, right? But if it has power, isn't it then necessary that it is directly elected? Or do you think that we can have a UN Parliamentary Assembly with strong powers that is based on national parliaments, like now the Pan-African Parliament? I think that's a very interesting question too.
that you can address? And then the other question was, can we imagine that there is popular support for this from your perspective in your countries? Like in the Gambia, are people concerned with the UN at all, for instance? Is that something on people's minds? I would assume probably not. I mean, not only there, but even here in Germany, you know, people are not concerned with this ordinarily. Although, you know, academics would tell you and the experts would tell you how closely interwoven all things are. Like laws in Germany, in the economic realm, 90% of them are predetermined by European regulations, you know, for instance. So perhaps you can also, Jimin, what's your opinion? Little pragmatic step or the big leap forward? What do you think?
Well, can I come in?
Yes, please.
Yes, thank you very much once again. I think, you know, as a country like the Gambia, we are an emerging democracy. We've been under dictatorship for about almost 22 years. And for the past 2-3 years, we've just actually emerged from being a dictatorship to a more democratic institution. Now, personally, I think it's better to do it on a step-by-step basis instead of like going full-fledged. I think we need to build that political will, and to build that political will, it really needs to have some steps to be taken. So that by the time we go 2, 3, or 4 years down the line, I think the political will be there, and so that we can go full-fledged. Just like what we are seeing now with the Pan-African Parliament. Still, some countries are dragging their feet, even though we are working on the background, you know, lobbying to ensure that they sign and ratify and deposit the instrument. So I think just to jump to a leap to full-fledged Parliament, I think that would be really asking for too much. But I think when we do it step by step, have that network first, and from network we start to do a lot of sensitization, a lot of education, the legislature and the executive, and people will become more and more understand really what this network is about. And then gradually we can migrate to a more full-fledged Parliament.
Thank you very much. I would just like to say all of our panelists, they can take the floor whenever they wish and they have a thought in terms of this discussion. One question that has been put forward by the audience is that item of the Interparliamentary Union, the umbrella organization of national parliaments. I don't know if you've actually had any contact with them, but obviously they are the body of national parliaments at this time, and I believe they are, let's say, developing a relationship with the UN. And so one could argue that the pragmatic steps in a way already exist, because we do have the IPU's UN committee. There are actual perhaps 24 of international parliamentary institutions on a network basis that are dealing with global topics, on the environment, on small arms, on other matters. So perhaps the critical question is, how do we build the political will on behalf of the governments to do this inside the UN? So perhaps you have some more thoughts on this. We have 9 minutes left for this discussion. I will have a look again into the questions. I would like to ask you, the audience, to put your questions into the chat box, because our time overall was very short, and it is much more better if it's possible to look at the written questions to include them into this discussion. Did I see, Lita, did you raise your hand, or did I?
Yes, yes, I did.
You have the floor.
Yes, just a minute. I think that you point one important thing. Does the parliament has to have power or has to have influence? I guess that is this is one of the problems of the Mercosur parliament, because it doesn't have power and also has have influence. And I guess that the problem is that this parliament first has not differentiated agenda, that I think it is very important. But on the other side, this parliament has to offer to the citizens something different. I guess that we have the problem that political parties are going through, are just changing because the society is changing and the political parties also. So I'm trying to answer one of the questions that were pointed in the chat related to citizen participation. People that doesn't necessarily participate in everything. There are citizens that are worried about global problems. Others don't. And so I think that we have to think in working with those that are involved in this kind of problems. So it is necessary to have a relationship with a global organization, and especially with global organization of young people, because this is for them. And I mean young people 20 on until 50, yeah? Because people live a lot of time now, but no, really until 40. But the kind of representations we know that works in politics is through political parties. And so I think we have to enforce them. And a question that is necessary to discuss is about the influence. I guess that the great opportunity is to have an organization that makes control on the United States programs and the way the implementation is done. And that is a thing that could be interested for citizens, no? To check on the organization that have the capability of decisions. Instead, you can be an organization to influence, but if you have an agenda and you have a capacity, an organization with capacity, with professional members that give you a good information and advice, you will have the opportunity to influence. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are coming to the close of this session, and we have addressed quite a lot of interesting questions, like whether indirect elections or direct elections are possible or the way forward, what kind of powers, I mean, in terms of scope, a UN Parliamentary Assembly should have. Should it be a consultative body at the beginning, or should we strive towards a body that has supranational powers? We have talked about the bad situation of parliaments at this stage at the national level under the condition of COVID. And one thing we could reflect more on later is what lessons can we draw from that? We have spoken about the challenges of the Mercosur Parliament. We have heard about the situation right now at the Pan-African Parliament. We have heard also of the example of the European Parliament and how far a UNPA could help strengthen opposition even at the national level. So not only be a tool to democratize the UN, but perhaps also a tool to democratize, help democratize especially countries in transition. So I think this was a very rich and encouraging debate, because well, maybe there was some unconscious, of course, selection process going on here, but we were actually striving towards a discussion with members of parliament who we know support the idea, because we wanted to reflect how can we implement it really, and how can we build momentum. If you have any final thoughts, because we just have 3 minutes left, I'm very sorry, I have to say to the audience, I have seen a couple of more questions, but we cannot have another whole round of interventions because of the time. Nonetheless, perhaps, there will be a possibility to follow up later in one way or another. So if you have any final thoughts, it's not a must, But if you have such, now there is an opportunity for a last round of interventions for all of our panelists. And if you would like to take the floor, just let me, you know, see your hand and you'll be able to talk. Darren?
Just to say that thank you for having me, and you've definitely got a mascot in me. Definitely that this is something to push forward, and thanks very much. I've enjoyed every bit of it.
Thank you, Darren. We'll be in touch for sure.
Thank you.
Did I see any other interventions? Not at this time. Dominic, yes.
It's very quickly, just to say on the previous question of what should we aim for, I think we have to recognize that unfortunately we're quite far from our goal at this stage. And for many people, a UN Parliamentary Assembly is out of their frame. No? So taking this into account, I think we should grab any opportunity to move closer to the objective. As it has been said, the European Parliament at the beginning did not have legislative powers. So I wouldn't worry about that right now. Let's set it up, and then let's trust that there will be a new dynamic that will operate on its own.
Thank you very much, Dominic. That's encouraging. And I'm just looking whether there are other interventions. That does not seem to be the case. If it is, let me know. So we have come to the end of this online event. I would like to thank again all of our excellent panelists for your participation, for your involvement in this project. And we would be very interested in working with you more on implementation, building on all of your expertise, well, your connections, your political weight. That would be really excellent. And I would also like to thank the Stimson Center again, Richard and Christina, who organized this. And I understand that the next sessions are beginning just in a few minutes. So it is our duty to be punctual. And again, sorry to the audience if some of the questions have not been addressed. I hope that there will be future opportunities for such events again in the future, where we might look at them. And thank you very much. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you to you, Andreas.
Thank you for having us. Okay, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.